This is the reason the Allies did not land at a port on D-Day. On the morning of the 19th of August, 1942, 4,963 Canadian soldiers sailed for the French seaside town of Dieppe, and within 10 hours 3,367 of them were dead, wounded, or in German hands, the single bloodiest day Canada suffered in the Second World War. 6,086 Allied troops went ashore that morning. 916 Canadians were killed. 1,946 were taken prisoner, more prisoners than the Canadian Army would lose in 11 months of fighting across Northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945. 29 Churchill tanks crawled off their landing craft onto the beach at Dieppe. Not one of them came home. And 22 months later, when the largest amphibious invasion in human history came ashore in Normandy, it came ashore on open sand. Not into a harbor. Not into a port. Onto empty beaches, dragging its own artificial harbors behind it across the channel in concrete sections, because of what happened on the chert of Dieppe. That is the standard version of this story. Dieppe as the rehearsal. Dieppe as the terrible price paid in advance for the success of Operation Overlord. Lord Louis Mountbatten, who ran the organization that planned the raid, spent the rest of his life promoting a version of that idea, the claim, endlessly repeated since, that for every man who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day. That line is worth examining closely, because no verified speech, no dated publication, and no primary document containing those words has ever been located. It circulates as a paraphrase. It circulates because it is comforting. And the historian Patrick Bishop is among those who have argued that Mountbatten's decades-long promotion of the D-Day rehearsal narrative was, in large part, self-serving. So this video is not going to tell you that Dieppe was a rehearsal for D-Day. It is going to do something more useful. It is going to show you exactly what happened on that beach, hour by hour, the missing bombardment, the wrong side of a river, the 12 men in the buildings, the stones that destroyed the tank tracks, and then it is going to show you which specific pieces of Operation Overlord can actually be traced back to that failure, which cannot, and why serious historians have been arguing about the difference for 80 years. Because there is a second story underneath this one. Declassified intelligence files, released decades later, revealed that a small unit of commandos went ashore at Dieppe that morning with a target that had nothing to do with capturing the town, and everything to do with a machine sitting in a German naval headquarters. What that unit was after, and whether the entire raid was built around it, is one of the most contested questions in the history of the Second World War. Let us start with why the raid happened at all. In the spring of 1942, the war was being lost. Not in the sense that the Allies were about to surrender, but in the sense that the German offensive in the east, Case Blue, was driving towards Stalingrad, and the Soviet Union was absorbing casualties on a scale the Western Allies could not conceive of and could not match. Joseph Stalin's demand was constant and it was simple. Open a second front in Western Europe. Force the Germans to pull divisions. Stalin's figure was around 40 of them, off the Eastern Front and send them west. The pressure was not abstract diplomatic noise. It arrived in person. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov traveled to London, where meetings began on the 21st of May, 1942, and then on to Washington later that same month. In Washington, President Roosevelt told Molotov that the United States expected to establish a second front, and on the 11th of June, 1942 a White House communique went out to the world referring to the urgent tasks of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. That communique was published. It was read in Moscow. It was read in Berlin. And it created a public commitment that the British military leadership had no intention of honoring on that timetable. Because when Molotov passed back through London on his return journey, Winston Churchill handed the Soviet foreign minister an aide memoir, and the operative sentence in that document was this: "We can therefore give no promise in the matter." Consider what that gap represents in modern terms. A public announcement of a deliverable, made by one partner in an alliance under political pressure, immediately followed by a private memo from the other partner walking the commitment back. Any project manager who has watched a client-facing press release outrun what the engineering team actually agreed to build will recognize the shape of the problem precisely. The difference is that in 1942 the deliverable was an invasion of a continent, and the gap between the announcement and the capability had to be filled with something. Something visible. Something soon. What could actually be delivered was the central argument between London and Washington that year. The American position was aggressive and direct. The Marshall Memorandum, presented in London on the 8th of April, 1942, pushed hard for a concentration on the cross-channel route into Europe. Two operations sat on the table. Operation Roundup was the full cross-channel invasion, planned for 1943, envisaging roughly 48 divisions, of which 18 would be British. Operation Sledgehammer was the emergency contingency, a 1942 landing to seize Brest or Cherbourg and hold it, essentially a sacrificial lodgment designed to draw German strength westward if the Soviet Union appeared to be collapsing. The British thought Sledgehammer was madness. The historian Robin Neal-Lands described the proposal as little short of blackmail, and as lunacy. Britain would be providing the overwhelming majority of the troops for an operation with no realistic prospect of survival, launched to make a political point. At the Second Washington Conference in June 1942, Roosevelt and Churchill made the decision. The cross-channel invasion was postponed. Priority went instead to Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, and that substitution was formally agreed at the Second Claridge Conference in London between the 20th and 26th of July, 1942. So by midsummer 1942 the strategic situation was this. A second front had been publicly promised for 1942. A second front was not going to happen in 1942. The Soviet Union was fighting for Stalingrad, and the Western Allies needed to demonstrate, to Moscow and to their own populations, that they were capable of putting troops onto the coast of occupied France and taking them off again. That gap is where the Dieppe Raid was born. There was a second motive, and it belonged to a different service entirely. RAF Fighter Command wanted a battle. The Luftwaffe had introduced the Focke-Wulf 190, an aircraft superior to the Spitfire variants then in service, and Fighter Command wanted to force a mass engagement on ground of its own choosing, over the French coast, within range, with the RAF able to concentrate and the Germans obliged to respond. Ultra-intelligence told the British something valuable here. Any Allied attempt to seize a French port would trigger a maximum German air response. For Fighter Command, that was not a warning. That was the entire point. Hold that detail. It matters later, when the claims come in. The organization that planned the Dieppe Raid grew out of the worst defeat in British military history. After the evacuation from Dunkirk in May 1940, Britain had been thrown off the continent entirely, and Combined Operations Headquarters was developed to answer a specific question: how do you get back on? Combined Operations existed to raid, to test, and to develop the techniques of amphibious warfare, and on the 4th of March, 1942 Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten was promoted to Chief of Combined Operations. Mountbatten's elevation was extraordinary. He was granted the acting ranks of Vice Admiral, Air Marshal, and Lieutenant General simultaneously, and raised to full member status at Chiefs of Staff meetings. The naval planner at the center of the operation was Captain John Hughes Hallett, who would go on to serve as the naval force commander for the raid itself. Brigadier Charles Hayton was also closely involved in the planning process. Planning began around the 25th of April, 1942 under the code name Operation Rudder. The Chiefs of Staff approved Rudder in May. Training started on the 20th of May. And on the 27th of April, 1942, Bernard Montgomery, then at Southeastern Command, offered the operation to Lieutenant General Harry Crerar of I Canadian Corps. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division was nominated. It is worth pausing on why the Canadians. By 1942 Canadian troops had been stationed in Britain for over 2 years without a major action. Lieutenant General Andrew MacNaughton, commanding Canadian forces overseas, and Crerar both approved Canadian participation, and both were under pressure, from their own men, from Ottawa, and from a public that wanted to know what the Canadian Army was actually doing in this war. The historian Peter Henshaw has examined exactly this dimension in an article whose title asks the question directly: was the Dieppe Raid a product of misplaced Canadian nationalism? The soldiers of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division wanted the job. That is part of the tragedy of what follows, and it does not sit comfortably in the simpler version of this story where Canadians were simply handed a British disaster. Operation Rudder was scheduled for early July 1942, with dates in the window of the 4th to the 8th. Then it fell apart. Weather delayed the operation. German aircraft found and bombed the assembled ships in the Solent. In an attack on the 7th of July, 2 ships were hit, though the bombs failed to explode fully. Between the weather, the delays, and the near certainty that Surprise had been compromised, Rudder was cancelled in early July 1942. By every normal standard of military operations, that should have been the end of it. The plan was known to be compromised. The force had been stood down. The season was advancing. Instead, on the 10th of July, 1942, the plan was revived, essentially unchanged, under a new name, Operation Jubilee. And here we reach the single strangest fact about the Dieppe Raid, and the one that has fueled 80 years of argument. No written high-level authorization for the remounting of the raid has ever been found. Robin Neil Lands put it plainly: historians have been searching for written authorization for 6 decades and failed to find any paper giving the appropriate high-level authority for launching Jubilee. Churchill's own explanation, given in his war memoirs, was that the absence of paperwork was deliberate. In discussion with Mountbatten, Churchill wrote, "It became clear that there was no time to mount a new large-scale operation that summer, but that Dieppe could be remounted under the new code name Jubilee within a month, provided extraordinary steps were taken to ensure secrecy, and for that reason, no records were kept." Churchill went on to state that after the Canadian authorities and the Chiefs of Staff had given approval, he personally went through the plans with the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, with Mountbatten, and with Hughes Hallett. That is the official account. Secrecy explains the silence. In 1989, Oxford University Press published a book by the Canadian historian Brian Loring Villa titled Unauthorized Action, Mountbatten and the Dieppe Raid, and Villa's argument was that the official account does not hold. Villa contended that the remount was never properly authorized by the Chiefs of Staff or the Prime Minister at all, and that Mountbatten proceeded on his own initiative. Villa noted that Mountbatten admitted afterwards he had no authority to proceed following the cancellation of Rudder except on the basis of a new request, and that the required full outline submission was never made. The implication is severe. It suggests that 916 Canadians died in an operation that no one in the British High Command had formally signed off. Villa's thesis did not go unchallenged. Peter Henshaw published a direct rebuttal in the journal War in History in 1994, under a title that asks the question straight: did Mountbatten really evade the committee's authority? Villa and Henshaw then argued it out in print in the Canadian Historical Review in June 1998, in an exchange published as The Dieppe Raid Debate. Where the argument stands today is that Villa's authorization thesis is not broadly accepted by historians, though his analysis of the planning process is widely respected. But note what neither side can produce. Neither side can produce the document. The absence itself is real, whatever explains it, and the explanation for that absence, whether it was operational secrecy or something less defensible, remains genuinely unresolved. Keep that in mind, because later in this story we are going to encounter a very different explanation for why the Dieppe files were so thin. Operation Jubilee had a set of objectives that, written down, look almost reasonable. The force was to seize and briefly hold the port of Dieppe. It was to destroy the port facilities, the coastal defenses, a radar station, and an airfield. It was to capture prisoners and intelligence material. It was to test whether a defended port could be taken from the sea at all. And it was to boost Allied morale and demonstrate commitment to a Western front to an increasingly impatient Soviet ally. Now look at what was stripped out of the plan to achieve those objectives. The heavy bomber bombardment was cancelled. A preliminary bombing raid by heavy bombers had been part of the design and it was removed. The army objected on the grounds that bombing the town would fill the streets with rubble and block the tanks. The RAF argued that most of the bombs would fall in the sea or land too far inland to matter. Both arguments had internal logic. The combined result was that the assault troops would land against defenses that had not been touched. There was no heavy naval gunfire support, no battleships, no cruisers. The naval force included 8 destroyers, and those destroyers were Hunt-class ships mounting 4-inch guns. Mountbatten pressed for the firepower of a battleship. Mountbatten was refused. The Royal Navy was not prepared to risk a capital ship in the confined, mined, air-threatened waters of the Eastern Channel for a raid. So the fire support for an assault on a fortified port consisted of 4-inch destroyer guns and strafing fighters. The plan was a frontal assault on a defended harbor town. Combined operations had originally proposed flanking landings, a pincer, coming at Dieppe from either side and closing on the town from the landward flanks, where the defenses were weaker. That concept was replaced by a direct assault across the main beach in front of the town, supported by flank landings. Montgomery is associated with the decision for the frontal assault, and Montgomery's reasoning was recorded. If the raid did not actually take Dieppe, it would be seen as a failure. Read that logic again, because it is the hinge of the entire disaster. The most dangerous version of the plan was selected because the safer version would not look decisive enough. The target itself was chosen for the wrong reasons. Dieppe sat within RAF fighter range, which mattered enormously to Fighter Command's ambitions for the air battle. But Dieppe also sat in a bay, dominated by headlands and cliffs on both flanks, and inside those headlands the Germans had tunneled positions and rail-mounted artillery that Allied planners did not know were there. And then there was the beach. The assault commanders were told to expect a beach surface offering good grip for tracked vehicles. What was actually there was chert. Chert is a hard, rounded flint. The stones on the Dieppe foreshore ran roughly 1 to 6 inches across, loose, steep-banked, and utterly unlike sand. When a 40-ton Churchill tank drives onto that surface, the stones do not compact. They roll. They ride up into the running gear. They jam the tracks and they throw the tracks off the sprockets entirely. This is a materials engineering failure, and it is exactly the kind of failure that still happens today. Any engineer who has watched a vehicle designed and validated on one surface fail catastrophically on another, a rover on unexpected regolith, a machine tested on a proving ground that does not match the terrain it is deployed to, is looking at the Dieppe problem. The specification said one thing. The ground was another thing. Nobody had put a hand into those stones and reported back. Except that somebody could have. This is where the intelligence failure compounds. The intelligence was old and it was wrong. Planners believed the Dieppe sector was held by the German 110th Division. It was not. It was held by the 302nd Static Infantry Division. The garrison strength was estimated at around 1,500 men. In the wider area there were closer to 6,000. More accurate intelligence existed. Ultra, the British decryption of German signals, held better material. It was not passed down to the assault commanders, because the security rules around Ultra restricted who could see it and in what form. The men going ashore were briefed from an out-of-date picture while a more accurate one sat in a locked room. That is the plan. No heavy bombing. No naval guns above 4 inches. A frontal assault chosen partly for appearances. A beach nobody had correctly surveyed. An enemy order of battle that had changed. And a raid whose predecessor had been cancelled because the enemy had probably already seen it. The men who would carry it out were told something rather different. Major General John Hamilton Roberts, commanding the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and the military force commander for the raid, is reported to have told his men in a pre-raid briefing, "Don't worry men, it'll be a piece of cake." Those 5 words would follow John Hamilton Roberts for the rest of his life. Before we go to the beaches, it is worth being precise about who was on those landing craft, because the composition of the force explains a great deal about how the day would be remembered. The Corps was the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General John Hamilton Roberts. Roberts would command from HMS Calpe, a Hunt-class destroyer serving as the headquarters ship, with a second headquarters ship, HMS Fernie, in support. The Canadian units read like a roll call of the country itself. In 4th Brigade, the Royal Regiment of Canada, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, and the Essex Scottish Regiment. In 6th Brigade, Les Fusiliers Mont Royal, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, and the South Saskatchewan Regiment. 3 platoons of the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, were attached for the landing at Puys. Armor came from the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment, the Calgary Regiment, equipped with Churchill tanks. The Calgary Regiment carried a distinction it would rather not have earned. It was the first Canadian tank unit to go into battle in the Second World War, and the first Canadian armored unit to take part in an amphibious assault. 2 brigadiers went with the force. Sherwood Lett commanded 4th Brigade and would be wounded without ever landing. William Wallace Southam commanded 6th Brigade, and Southam will return to this story in a way he would never have wanted. The British contribution was the commando element, and it was formidable. Number 3 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater with Major Peter Young as second in command, was assigned to Berneville on the eastern flank, targeting a coastal battery the Allies codenamed Goebbels. Their part of the raid carried the code name Operation Flodden. Number 4 Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser, the 15th Lord Lovat, with Major Derek Mills Roberts as second in command, was assigned to Varengeville on the western flank, targeting the battery codenamed Hess, in an operation codenamed Cauldron. Royal Marine A Commando, under Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Picton Phillips, was held for a later role. Personnel from No. 10 Interallied Commando and Free French troops were also embarked, around 15 Free French commandos, by French records. And then there were 50 Americans. Approximately 50 men of the U.S. 1st Ranger Battalion were distributed among the British commandos, 42 of them attached to No. 3 Commando. Their presence at Dieppe means that this raid produced the first American ground combat deaths in Europe in the Second World War. Lieutenant Edward Loustalot was killed at Yellow Beach. Corporal Franklin Coons, serving with No. 4 Commando on the other flank, is credited as being among the first American soldiers to kill a German in the ground war in Europe. 2 American milestones, on the same morning, on opposite flanks of the same failed raid. The naval force under Captain John Hughes Hallett totaled 237 ships and landing craft. Beyond the 8 destroyers, including Kalpe, Fernie, Berkeley, Brocklesby, and the Polish destroyer ORP Slazak, there was the river gunboat HMS Locust and a fleet of landing ships with names that sound like a cross-channel ferry timetable: Prince Albert, Princess Beatrix, Invicta, Glengyle, Prince Leopold, Prince Charles, Queen Emma, Princess Astrid. Free French chasseurs sailed with them. Overhead, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory of No. 11 Group, RAF Fighter Command, would control the air battle from headquarters at RAF Uxbridge. 74 RAF squadrons and 2 RCAF squadrons were committed. On the other side of the channel, waiting, was General Lieutenant Conrad Hasse and the 302nd Static Infantry Division, with divisional headquarters at Envermeu. The 302nd fielded 3 infantry regiments, the 570th, 571st, and 572nd, each of 2 battalions, plus divisional artillery, reconnaissance, anti-tank, engineer, and signals battalions. Above Hasse sat 81st Corps, and above 81st Corps sat Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West. In the air, Luftflotte 3 with Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26, and the Dornier 217 bombers of Kampfgeschwader 2. The force sailed on the 18th of August, 1942 from Southampton, Portsmouth, Newhaven, and Shoreham. Before the shooting starts, it is worth laying out how Operation Jubilee was supposed to work, because the plan was not stupid. The plan was elegant. That is precisely what was wrong with it. The design was a sequence, and every step depended on the step before it. First, at 4:50 in the morning, the outer flanks. No. 3 Commando at Berneville in the east and No. 4 Commando at Varengeville in the west would land in darkness and destroy the 2 coastal batteries, Goebbels and Hesse, whose heavy guns could reach the ships lying off Dieppe. Until those batteries were dead, the fleet supporting the main assault was sitting inside the beaten zone of artillery it could not fight. Second, minutes later, the inner flanks. The Royal Regiment of Canada at Puis in the east and the South Saskatchewan Regiment with the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders at Pourville in the west would land in the dark, climb, and take the headlands on either side of Dieppe from behind. Those headlands were the shoulders of the bay. Every machine gun and every gun position in them looked directly down the length of the main beach. Third, at 5:20, the main assault. With the batteries destroyed and the headlands taken, the Essex Scottish Regiment and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry would land in front of the town against defences that had already been outflanked and unhinged, supported by the Churchill tanks of the Calgary Regiment arriving with them. Fourth, exploitation. Engineers would clear obstacles and demolish the port installations. The tanks would push into the town. Prisoners and intelligence material would be taken. And then the whole force would withdraw across the beaches before German reserves, the 10th Panzer Division was known to be inland, could arrive in strength. That is a coherent operation. Read on paper, at a planning table in England, it works. Now count the assumptions it rests on. It assumes darkness at 4:50 in the morning and enough of it. It assumes the flank landings arrive at the time specified, because a landing at Puis 20 minutes late is a landing in daylight. It assumes surprise holds until the first ramp drops. It assumes the commandos on the outer flanks reach their batteries. It assumes the inner flank battalions take the headlands within roughly half an hour, before the main assault comes in beneath them. It assumes the tanks cross the beach. It assumes the engineers survive to clear the obstacles. It assumes the radios work well enough for a commander offshore to know which of these things has happened. 8 assumptions. Every one of them a link in a single chain, and the chain has no slack in it anywhere. Anyone who has built a project schedule recognizes this structure immediately. Operation Jubilee was a plan with no float. Every task sat on the critical path, each one a prerequisite for the next, with no buffer between them and no fallback if any single element slipped. Modern project management has an entire vocabulary for this failure: single points of failure, cascading dependencies, tightly coupled systems, and one governing rule that comes out of it: the more steps that must all succeed for the outcome to succeed, the lower the probability of the outcome, and the decline is not gradual, it is multiplicative. 8 steps at 90% reliability each do not give you 90%. They give you something closer to 40. And the planners of Jubilee were not working with 90%. They were working with a night crossing in small craft, an alerted coastline, out-of-date intelligence about the defending division, no bombardment to soften anything, and radios of 1942 vintage carried by men wading through surf. There is a second structural problem sitting underneath the first, and it is worse. The plan had no branch. There was no documented answer to the question, what do we do if the headlands are not taken by 5:20? The main assault was going in at 5:20 regardless. Once the Essex Scottish Regiment and the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry were in their craft and running for red and white beaches, there was no mechanism by which anyone could look at the state of Puys, conclude that the eastern headland was still firing, and stop them. That is what happened. The eastern headland was never taken. The main assault went in underneath it anyway, exactly on schedule, into exactly the fire the plan had been designed to eliminate. And there is one more thing about this timetable that deserves to be said before the landings begin, because it is easy to lose in the arithmetic of casualties. Every unit in this plan performed its own part of it. Number 4 Commando destroyed its battery on time. Major Peter Young's 18 men engaged a coastal battery they had no business engaging. The Royal Regiment of Canada crossed a beach in daylight into prepared machine gun fire and got men to the seawall. The Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada advanced 3 kilometers inland. Cecil Merritt got his regiment across a swept bridge. The Calgary Regiment put 15 40-ton tanks over a seawall onto an esplanade. The men did the tasks. What failed was the structure that required all of the tasks to succeed simultaneously, and the intelligence that described the ground they had to do them on. That distinction is the difference between blaming soldiers and blaming a plan, and Conrad Hasse, commanding the division that destroyed them, landed on the same conclusion from the other side of the wire when he recorded that the main reason the Canadians did not gain ground was not any lack of courage, but concentrated defensive fire. The force sailed on the evening of the 18th of August, 1942. The first thing that happened to Operation Jubilee happened before a single man reached France. At around 9:30 on the night of the 18th of August, British chain-home radar picked up a German coastal convoy moving along the French shore. The warning went out. It did not effectively reach the landing craft of No. 3 Commando, which were at that moment running east toward Berneville in small, thin-skinned wooden craft, spread across miles of dark water. At around 3:48 in the morning, some accounts give 3:43 or 3:47, the Eastern Landing Group ran directly into the German convoy off Berneville. Coasters with escorts, including S-boats. The exchange was short and violent and completely one-sided in effect. No. 3 Commando's flotilla was scattered across the channel. Roughly 4/5 of the force was lost, damaged, or turned back. Now here is the detail that turns a piece of bad luck into something harder to forgive. The destroyers HMS Brocklesby and ORP Slazak saw the action. Gun flashes on the water, close into the French coast, at 4 in the morning, on the night of a major raid. Both ships assumed they were watching shore batteries firing, and neither intervened. This is a signal interpretation failure, and the pattern is universal. 2 observers see a genuine anomaly. Both fit it to the most familiar available explanation. Neither escalates. Anyone who has worked an operations center, a trading desk, or a hospital night shift knows the shape of that failure. The alert fires, the alert matches something routine, the alert gets closed. The consequence at Dieppe was that a running gun battle off the invasion coast produced no warning to the fleet and no response. The consequence for the Germans was the opposite. The coastal defenses now knew that something was happening offshore. The alarm went out along the coast. Everything that follows on the eastern flank happens against a defender who is already awake. At 4:50 in the morning the flank landings began, and the 2 commando operations on the 2 flanks produced the 2 most different outcomes of the entire raid. Orange Beach, Varengeville. No. 4 Commando, roughly 252 men, had the cleanest plan of the day, a two-pronged assault on the Hesse battery, 6 heavy guns, recorded at 150 or 155 millimeters, sighted to fire on the main landing area. Major Derek Mills Roberts's group landed at Orange I at 4:50 in the morning, unobserved. Lord Lovat's group landed at Orange II near Quiberville and swung inland to come at the battery from behind. Mills Roberts's men worked into position around the battery perimeter and opened fire. At some point between 6 o'clock and 1:15, a 2-inch mortar bomb landed in a cordite and ammunition stack and detonated it. At about 6:30 the RAF came in with a fighter sweep across the battery position. And behind that noise and dust and smoke, Lovat's assault force went in. By 7 o'clock the guns of the Hesse battery had been destroyed. By 7:30 the commandos were withdrawing to the beach with their casualties. That is the whole of it. 1 battery, 6 guns, destroyed and evacuated in a little over 2 hours, on schedule, by a force that landed where it was supposed to land at the time it was supposed to land there. The assault was not bloodless. Officers including Captain Petterward were killed in the fighting, and Captain Patrick Porteous took over the assault after the officers leading it went down. Porteous was awarded the Victoria Cross. No. 4 Commandos' action at Varengeville is the only unqualified success of the Dieppe Raid. Everything else that morning ranges from partial to catastrophic, and the difference at Orange Beach was surprise, a limited objective, and a plan that did not require anyone to cross open ground in daylight under guns that had not been suppressed. Remember that combination. It is going to come back in 1944. Yellow Beach, Berneville. On the eastern flank, the same mission against the Goebbels battery ran into the wreckage of the convoy encounter. The main body of No. 3 Commando that reached Yellow I was effectively destroyed. Around 120 men were killed or captured. Lieutenant Edward Loustalot, the American Ranger, was among the dead. But at Yellow II, something remarkable happened. A single landing craft, LCP-15, under Lieutenant Buckey, put ashore somewhere between 18 and 20 commandos under Major Peter Young at around 4:45. 18 men. Against a coastal battery. Peter Young did not attempt to take the guns. Peter Young could not possibly have taken the guns. Instead Young's party worked into the tree line around the battery perimeter and began sniping at the gun crews, picking at the men serving the guns, forcing them to keep their heads down, disrupting the loading and the laying and the ranging, for as long as the ammunition held out. The Goebbels battery was never destroyed. But for a critical period, while ships lay offshore in range, a battery of heavy coastal guns was being fought by roughly 18 men with rifles in the woods, and its performance was degraded. Then Major Peter Young's party broke contact and withdrew to the sea. There is no monument to 18 men interrupting a battery. It does not fit into the narrative of Dieppe as unrelieved catastrophe, and it does not fit into the narrative of Dieppe as a rehearsal either. It simply happened, and the men who did it went home, which on this particular morning made them unusual. At Puys, a small village east of Dieppe, the Royal Regiment of Canada was to land at 4:50 in the morning in darkness, climb the cliffs, and take out the headland positions that dominated the main beach where the principal assault would come ashore. The Royal Regiment of Canada landed roughly 20 minutes late. The reason is almost unbearably small. The landing craft formed up behind the wrong gunboat in the dark and lost time sorting themselves out. 20 minutes. In August, on the French coast, 20 minutes is the difference between darkness and daylight. The first ramps went down at around 5:07. What the Royal Regiment of Canada found in front of them was a narrow strip of beach, a seawall, and rising ground behind it, and every meter of that beach was covered by German machine guns and mortars in prepared positions, positions belonging to a garrison that had been fully alerted since the convoy action offshore an hour earlier. The men who got across the beach were pinned beneath the seawall. The men who tried to climb the wall were cut down on it. The wire above the wall was uncut, because the bombardment that would have cut it had been cancelled in the planning. There was no way forward and, with the tide and the fire, no way back. The Royal Regiment of Canada held out under the seawall at Puys until roughly 8:30 in the morning, and then the survivors surrendered. Of the 556 men of the Royal Regiment of Canada who embarked for Dieppe, over 200 were killed and 264 were taken prisoner. The figure for how many came home to England varies by source, and the variance itself tells you something about the confusion of that day. Veterans Affairs Canada records that only 33 men out of more than 500 returned. Other accounts, including Canada's history, put the figure at 65 out of almost 600. Either way, the Royal Regiment of Canada suffered the highest proportional loss of any unit in the raid. A regiment recruited from Toronto ceased, in the space of about 3 hours, to exist as a fighting formation, and the tactical consequence rippled directly onto the main beach. The headland guns at Puis were never silenced, which means that when the main assault went in at Dieppe, the eastern headland was firing into its flank exactly as designed. West of Dieppe, at the village of Pourville, the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada came ashore at around 4:52, on time, in the dark, and with a degree of genuine surprise. For the first minutes, Green Beach was the second best news of the morning. Then the map problem asserted itself. Part of the South Saskatchewan Regiment landed on the wrong side of the River Science. The regiment's objectives lay east of the river. A significant portion of the regiment was now standing west of it. Between the two banks there was one bridge. What happened at that bridge produced one of the 2 Canadian Victoria Crosses of the raid. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment walked out onto a bridge swept by German machine gun fire, and called back to his men, "Come on over, there's nothing to it." Merritt crossed that bridge repeatedly, leading parties across under fire, and the South Saskatchewan Regiment got over the Science. It cost them, and it cost them time they did not have. Inland, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada pushed further than any other Allied unit that day, roughly 3 kilometers inland, driving toward the airfield and the German divisional headquarters area at Arques-la-Bataille. 3 kilometers does not sound like much until you remember that everywhere else on that coast the Allied advance was being measured in meters of shingle. The Camerons were halted short of their objectives. German reinforcement and the collapse of the flanks meant that a battalion 3 kilometers inland was a battalion about to be cut off. Both the Camerons and the South Saskatchewan Regiment were pushed back to Pourville, and the evacuation from Green Beach became a fighting withdrawal across open beach. Cecil Merritt was captured. Merritt spent roughly 3 years as a prisoner of war and survived. Pourville is where the raid came closest to functioning as designed, and it still failed, because a landing on the wrong side of a river, 20 minutes of lost time on another beach, and a coastal alarm that went out at 4 in the morning are not independent problems. They compound. Every plan that requires 5 separate things to happen on schedule is a plan that fails when the first one slips. At around 20 past 5, in full daylight, the main assault went in directly in front of the town of Dieppe. The Essex Scottish Regiment landed on Red Beach. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landed on White Beach. In front of them was a broad, steep bank of chert, then a seawall, then an esplanade, then the buildings of the town, and above and around all of it, on both headlands and in the cliff positions, the guns of the 302nd Static Infantry Division, entirely intact. There had been no preliminary bombing, because the heavy bomber raid had been cancelled. Fire support consisted of the 4-inch guns of the destroyers offshore and Hurricanes strafing the seafront. Against tunneled positions and cliff emplacements, 4-inch shells and machine gun fire from aircraft achieved very little. The German gunners in the headlands were shooting down the length of the beach, enfilade fire, the most efficient geometry in warfare, where every round that misses one man is still traveling toward the next. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry got men into the casino building at the western end of the beach and fought inside it. Some small parties got across the esplanade into the town itself. That is the high-water mark of the main assault at Dieppe, a handful of men in a casino and a few in the buildings beyond. The tanks landed around 5:35, 10 to 15 minutes late. 29 Churchills of the Calgary Regiment came off the landing craft. 2 drowned in deep water. 27 reached the beach. And on the beach they met the chert. The stones did exactly what stones of that size and shape do to a tracked vehicle. Tracks were thrown. Running gear jammed. Tanks bogged down in a surface that had been described to their crews as offering good grip. Roughly 15 of the 27 managed to cross the seawall onto the esplanade. 15 Churchill tanks, on the promenade of a French seaside town, in a raid that has just been described to you as a catastrophe. For a moment, that is a real armored presence. And then those 15 tanks arrived at the anti-tank obstacles and the concrete roadblocks sealing the exits from the seafront into the town, and stopped. Clearing those obstacles was an engineer task. The engineers who were to clear them did not survive the beach in sufficient numbers to do it. So the tanks that had made it over the wall could not get off the esplanade, and the tanks that could not get over the wall were stuck on the stones, and every one of them was now a stationary target inside an enemy fire plan. What the surviving crews did next deserves to be stated plainly. The mobile Churchills formed what has been described as a ring of steel, driving up and down the seafront, putting their armor between the German guns and the infantry pinned on the beach, and firing until they were knocked out or immobilized. They were not going anywhere. They knew they were not going anywhere. They stayed to shoot. Not one Churchill tank returned to England. Every tank landed at Dieppe was lost. The Calgary Regiment lost 13 killed and 167 taken prisoner. There is a postscript to the tanks that almost nobody covers. 5 of the Calgary Regiment's Churchills carried an experimental fitting called the beach track laying device, developed by a Royal Canadian Engineers officer named Sucherov, a mechanism intended to lay a trackway across soft or broken ground so that armor could cross it. 3 more Churchills carried oak flamethrower equipment. The individual tanks had names. 2 of the track layers were called Cougar and Buttercup. The flamethrower tanks were Boar, Bull, and Beetle. An experimental device to let tanks cross an impassable beach, landed at Dieppe in August 1942, on a beach that proved impassable. Hold that thought too. When we get to 1944 and a British armored division full of strange machines with names like Bobbin and Crocodile, you will want to remember that the idea did not arrive from nowhere. The Germans, meanwhile, took away a captured Churchill and assessed it. Their verdict, recorded in German intelligence terms, was that the Churchill in its present form was easy to combat, heavy, old-fashioned, and undergunned by comparison with what the Wehrmacht was meeting on the Eastern Front. Major General John Hamilton Roberts was fighting the battle from the deck of HMS Calpe, offshore, and Roberts could not see it. Smoke screens laid to cover the landings were covering the beach from Roberts as effectively as they covered it from the Germans. Radios failed. Signalers were killed on the beaches, and the sets that survived were operated by men under fire who had a fragmentary picture of a strip of shingle 40 meters wide. What reached HMS Calpe was noise, silence, and fragments. And then Calpe's listening set logged a message from the Essex Scottish Regiment to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. The words recorded were these: 12 of our men in the buildings. Have not heard from them for some time. Read that message as the men on Calpe read it, at 7 o'clock in the morning, in the dark, with nothing else coming in. Essex Scottish men are in the buildings. In the town. Off the beach. What the message actually meant was that a dozen men had got across and been swallowed, that contact with them had been lost, which is what, have not heard from them for some time, is telling you. What it was read to mean was a foothold in Dieppe. At around 7 o'clock, on that basis, John Hamilton Roberts committed his floating reserve. Les Fusiliers Mont Royal, the French-Canadian battalion of 6th Brigade, went into Red Beach believing they were reinforcing a success. They landed into the same enfilade fire that had already destroyed the 2 battalions ahead of them, on a beach that was by then covered with the wreckage of the first wave. Casualty and prisoner figures for Les Fusiliers Mont Royal vary between accounts, with sources giving numbers in the range of 288 to 584 men. At around 8:30, Roberts committed the Royal Marine A Commando toward the harbor. The Royal Marines came out of the smoke screen in their craft and were immediately raked by fire from positions that were entirely undamaged. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Picton Phillips, commanding, stood up in the open where the following craft could see him and signaled them to turn back. Picton Phillips was killed doing it. The signal worked. Craft turned away. This is the deepest lesson of Dieppe, and it has almost nothing to do with beaches. A commander made a catastrophic decision using data that was technically accurate and functionally meaningless. The message about the 12 men was true. 12 men had gone into the buildings. Every word logged on HMS Calpe was correct. The interpretation built on it was wrong, and the reason it was wrong is that Roberts had no way to weight that fragment against the total picture, because there was no total picture. Anyone who has run an incident from a dashboard understands this instinctively. When most of your telemetry goes dark, the surviving signal does not become less important, it becomes the entire world. A single green indicator on a screen where everything else has stopped reporting will be overread every time, by good people, under pressure. The failure is not the operator. The failure is an architecture that lets one surviving channel speak for the whole system. Dieppe is the reason the Allies would spend the next 2 years building command architecture that did not have that flaw: dedicated headquarters ships, redundant communication nets, and a beach control organization whose entire job was to see the beach and report it accurately. Roberts did not have any of that in August 1942. Roberts had a smoke screen, a broken radio net, and 12 men in the buildings. Around 9 o'clock the withdrawal was organized under the code word Vanquish. At about 10 minutes to 11, a general retreat order went out. Landing craft came back into a beach under heavy fire to take men off, and many of the men on that beach could not be reached at all. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon the code word Vancouver signaled the full naval withdrawal. At roughly 8 minutes past 1, the last message came in from the shore. The troops still on the beach at Dieppe had surrendered. 10 hours. That was the entire raid. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had ordered the 10th Panzer Division forward from Amiens at around 9 o'clock that morning. The advance guard reached Longueville-sur-Science. The battle was decided before a single German tank engaged. Remember that RAF Fighter Command had wanted this battle. On the 19th of August, 1942, the RAF and RCAF flew approximately 2,955 sorties over Dieppe. Some accounts count the fighter and bomber sorties at 2,617, with around 750 aircraft involved. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory got precisely the mass engagement he had asked for. Then the results came in. Allied aircraft losses were 106, of which at least 32 were lost to anti-aircraft fire or to accidents rather than to German fighters. The Royal Canadian Air Force lost 13 aircraft and 10 pilots. By several accounts, the 19th of August, 1942 stands among the heaviest single-day RAF losses of the entire war. Against that, RAF pilots claimed 96 German aircraft destroyed, 39 probably destroyed, and 135 damaged. Actual German losses were approximately 48 aircraft. Look at that gap. 96 claimed against roughly 48 actual. The claim was double the reality. This is not an accusation of dishonesty. Combat claim inflation is a structural feature of air warfare, not a moral failing of pilots. 3 fighters attack the same bomber, the bomber goes down, 3 men file a claim in good faith. An aircraft dives away trailing smoke and is recorded as destroyed when it lands safely 20 minutes later. Nobody lied. The counting method simply could not produce a true number. The actual German figures break down like this: of the roughly 48 aircraft lost, 28 were bombers, and about half of those bombers were the Dornier 217s of Kampfgeschwader 2. Jagdgeschwader 2 lost between 14 and 16 Focke-Wulf 190s and 8 pilots. Jagdgeschwader 26 lost 6 or 7 Focke-Wulf 190s. So the RAF committed nearly 3,000 sorties, lost 106 aircraft, and destroyed around 48. Fighter Command sought a decisive attritional battle with the Luftwaffe and lost that battle by a ratio of better than 2-1. And here is the cross-domain point, because this failure mode is not remotely confined to 1942. Every organization that measures its own performance using data generated by the people being measured runs the Dieppe air battle risk. The pilots reporting the kills were the pilots being assessed on kills. The reporting was sincere and the aggregate was wrong, and the aggregate was what commanders used to decide whether the operation had been worth it. Modern equivalents are everywhere: self-reported metrics rolled into an executive dashboard, engagement figures compiled by the team whose funding depends on engagement, any system where the censor and the subject are the same entity. The correction, both in 1942 and now, is independent verification, gun camera film, third-party rec counts, and captured enemy records. Which is precisely how we know the real number today. We know it because after the war the German records were read. The wartime British public was told the RAF had won a great victory over Dieppe. That claim shaped how the raid was understood for years afterwards, and it is the first of several places where the Dieppe story we inherited was constructed rather than observed. Here is what the raid cost, and the numbers deserve to be given slowly. Of the 4,963 Canadians who embarked for Dieppe, only 2,210 returned to England, and many of those were wounded. Total Canadian casualties, 3,367. That figure includes 1,946 prisoners of war. 916 Canadians were killed, according to Veterans Affairs Canada. Other authorities give 907 killed, and the historian Mark Zulka gives 913 dead or mortally wounded. The Canadian War Museum records more than 900 Canadian soldiers killed. The Canadian casualty rate for the operation was approximately 68%. 68%. Say that against any other engagement you know. 2 out of every 3 Canadians who went to Dieppe did not come back from it whole or did not come back at all. The other services and nations, the British Army lost 247 killed. The Royal Navy suffered 75 killed or died of wounds and 269 missing or taken prisoner, with total Allied naval casualties given at around 550. The Royal Air Force lost 62 men killed, with 30 wounded and 17 taken prisoner. The United States Army, the 50 Rangers, lost 3 killed, 5 wounded, and 3 captured. Of the 6,086 men committed, roughly 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured within 10 hours. Material losses: the Royal Navy lost 1 destroyer, HMS Berkeley, scuttled after being bombed, and 33 landing craft. All 27 tanks that reached the beach were lost. And now the German figures, which are the ones that make the arithmetic of the day unbearable. The German High Command communiqué admitted 591 casualties across all 3 services. The 302nd Static Infantry Division's own report, recorded in the Canadian official history by C.P. Stacey, gives the Army's losses as 5 officers and 116 other ranks killed, 6 officers and 195 other ranks wounded, and 11 other ranks missing. Roughly 121 German soldiers killed, against over 900 Canadians. The raid's stated objectives included the capture of prisoners and intelligence material. 37 German prisoners were actually brought back to England, and only 8 of those were Army. The German assessment of the Canadians was not contemptuous. General Lieutenant Konrad Hasse is quoted as concluding that the main reason the Canadians did not gain ground on the beaches was not any lack of courage, but the concentrated defensive fire, though it is worth noting that this quotation reaches us through secondary accounts. A German major who walked the beach afterwards recorded that he had not witnessed images more terrible, describing a landing craft in which the entire crew of about 40 men had been wiped out. 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Dieppe. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt of the South Saskatchewan Regiment, for the bridge at Pourville. Captain Patrick Porteous of No. 4 Commando, for the battery at Varengeville. And Honorary Captain John Refoot, the chaplain of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, who carried wounded men to the boats on the main beach and then deliberately allowed himself to be captured so that he could go into captivity with the men of his regiment and minister to them there. All 3 survived the war. The 2 Canadians spent roughly 3 years as prisoners. There is one more figure, and it belongs to a woman who never went near a landing craft. Sister Agnes Cécile Marie Madeleine Valois, born in Rouen on the 30th of June, 1914, was an Augustinian surgical nurse at the Hotel Dieu in Rouen who cared for the wounded Canadians brought in from the beach. The Canadians called her the Angel of Dieppe. Sister Agnes Marie Valois died on the 19th of April, 2018, aged 103, at a convent near Dieppe, and her verdict on what she had seen was this: it wasn't war, it was a massacre. Now we come to the part of this story that did not exist in the public record for 70 years. In 2012, a Canadian historian named David O'Keefe released a documentary called Dieppe Uncovered, and in 2013 he published a book called One Day in August. O'Keefe had spent something in the order of 15 to 20 years working through roughly 100,000 pages of declassified intelligence documents, and his argument was this: the Dieppe Raid was, in significant part, a cover operation for an intelligence mission. The target was cryptographic material, specifically, a 4-rotor Enigma machine and its associated documents, for Bletchley Park. In 1942, German naval Enigma had gone to 4 rotors, and the codebreakers had been locked out of the U-boat traffic in the Atlantic at the worst possible moment in the tonnage war. The way back in was not mathematics. The way back in was theft. The British called it a pinch. The mission at Dieppe was organized within the Naval Intelligence Division, where the officer involved was Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond, then a serving naval intelligence officer. The unit tasked to execute it was the Intelligence Assault Unit, later known as 30 Assault Unit or 30 Commando. Their objective was a German naval headquarters believed to be located at the Hotel Moderne in Dieppe. Let us separate what is established from what is contested, because this is where a lot of documentaries stop being careful. What is established, and accepted by O'Keefe's critics as well as his supporters: 30 Assault Unit existed and was present at Dieppe. Ian Fleming was involved and was offshore during the raid. A British pinch policy existed as formal doctrine, deliberate operations mounted to seize cryptographic material. And O'Keefe located the document that records the outcome in one flat sentence: the party concerned at Dieppe did not reach their target. GCHQ expedited the release of Ultra Signals intelligence histories to O'Keefe for this research. None of that is in dispute. A cryptographic snatch mission went ashore at Dieppe, and it failed. What is contested is the scale of the claim, that the entire raid was mounted as cover for the pinch. Tim Cook of the Canadian War Museum rejects that reading directly, arguing that the idea the whole Dieppe raid was merely a cover for the commando pinch is a case of the tail wagging the dog, while conceding that O'Keefe did prove combined operations ran pinch raids. Mark Zulka, author of Tragedy at Dieppe, argues that O'Keefe presents the thesis as incontrovertible fact when it is not, and that for every document supporting the thesis, many others contradict it, and Zulka uses the same image, that we should resist letting the tail wag the dog. Other historians have been considerably warmer. Peter Henshaw called it the biggest breakthrough of the last 20 years. Stephen Prince, head of the Royal Navy's Naval Historical Branch, supported the work, as did Julian Thompson. The Canadian historian Mike Bechtold offered qualified praise, describing it as the first truly new understanding of the raid in more than 70 years, and crediting it with explaining something that had never made tactical sense before: the late commitment of Les Fusiliers Mont Royal and the Royal Marine A Commando toward the harbor area. That last point deserves weight. If you believe the raid was purely a conventional operation, then throwing the reserve and then the Royal Marines toward the harbor at 8:30 in the morning, into a beach that was visibly a slaughter, is simply Roberts making bad decisions in the dark. If you believe there was a specific building in Dieppe that somebody desperately needed reached, those two commitments acquire a rationale. The International Churchill Society's assessment is a reasonable place to sit. It is difficult to accept that a major operation like Dieppe would have been launched for that reason alone. But now go back to Section 2 of this story, and the missing authorization for Operation Jubilee that historians have hunted for 6 decades without finding. Churchill's explanation was secrecy. Villa's explanation was that Mountbatten acted without authority. And there is a third possibility that only becomes visible once you know that a Bletchley Park cryptographic operation was embedded in the raid, that some Dieppe files are thin because they touch the most closely guarded secret of the war, and material connected to Ultra was handled under rules that did not permit ordinary record-keeping. That is an inference, not a documented finding, and it should be labeled as one. But it is the kind of inference that explains why a straightforward-looking question, who signed off on this raid, has resisted 80 years of professional historians. 1,946 Canadians went into German captivity on the 19th of August, 1942, and what happened to them next produced an international crisis. It began with a brigadier and a piece of paper. Brigadier William Wallace Southam of 6th Brigade carried his classified copy of the assault plan ashore with him, against orders. When the position became hopeless, Southam attempted to bury the document in the shingle. The Germans recovered it. That document is reported to have contained instructions relating to the binding of prisoners, the tying of German captives' hands during the raid to prevent them from escaping while under commando escort. In October 1942, following the capture of that plan, and following the Sark raid in the Channel Islands during which bound German prisoners were killed while reportedly attempting to escape, Hitler ordered that Allied prisoners be shackled. The order was announced on the 9th of October, 1942, and it affected approximately 1,376 Allied prisoners, the majority of them Canadians taken at Dieppe. Britain and Canada retaliated by shackling German prisoners in their own custody. That retaliation produced one of the strangest engagements of the war, the Battle of Bowmanville, a prisoner-of-war camp uprising in Ontario that began on the 10th of October, 1942, when German prisoners in a Canadian camp physically resisted being shackled. Swiss mediation eventually brought the practice to an end, with an agreement reached with Canada on the 12th of December, 1942. The Dieppe raid and the Sark raid together are widely cited as the events that brought about Hitler's commando order of the 18th of October, 1942, the directive that Allied commandos captured on raiding operations were to be killed rather than treated as prisoners of war. The commando order was, and is, a war crime, and it was issued in direct response to the raiding campaign of which Dieppe was the largest example. So one consequence of Operation Jubilee was that it made commando operations for the rest of the war measurably more lethal for the men conducting them. The dead were left in France, and what happened to them there is worth recording. The Germans buried the Allied dead near Dieppe, laying out the graves in the German fashion, headstones back to back in rows. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery at Haute-sur-Mer retains that distinctive layout to this day, the only Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery of its kind arranged that way, because the Commission chose not to disturb the original arrangement. The cemetery holds 948 Commonwealth burials and commemorations from the Second World War, of which 187 are unidentified, along with 7 non-Commonwealth burials and 2 from other periods. More than 700 of the Canadian dead of Dieppe lie there. And there was a reckoning at home, though not for everyone. Major General John Hamilton Roberts was criticized for his handling of Exercise Spartan in March 1943, and in April 1943 Roberts was transferred to the Canadian Reinforcement Units. Roberts never received another operational command. Whether or not the transfer was formally about Dieppe, it is widely understood as the moment the Canadian Army closed the file on him. Every year on the anniversary of the raid, Dieppe veterans sent John Hamilton Roberts a small, stale piece of cake, a reminder of 5 words spoken in a briefing room before anyone knew what the beach was made of. Roberts's only recorded public comment on his own fate was 4 words long: "History will exonerate me." Mountbatten's career did not end at Dieppe. Mountbatten went on to become Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia, and spent the following decades promoting the interpretation of Dieppe that placed the raid at the foundation of the Normandy landings. The way the raid was reported was also managed. The historian Timothy Balzer, in *The Information Front*, published by UBC Press in 2011, and in an article in the Canadian Historical Review in 2006 examining how Dieppe was sold to Canadians, documented how the Canadian Army's public relations and censorship apparatus handled the story, including an initial presentation of the raid that framed it as something close to a victory. Balzer also documented that British Army press services initially failed to credit the 2nd Canadian Division for the operation at all. Canadian soldiers made up more than 80% of the assault force and suffered the overwhelming majority of the casualties, and the first accounts released to the world did not clearly say so. That is the origin of a resentment that lasted generations in Canada, the belief that Canadian soldiers were used as, in the phrase that has followed this raid since, cannon fodder, and were not even properly credited for it. Dieppe entered Canadian national memory not as a battle but as a wound, and it remains one of the defining events in how Canada remembers the Second World War. The most consequential audience for the Dieppe raid was not in London or Ottawa. It was in Berlin and at the headquarters of Commander-in-Chief West. What the German High Command took from the 19th of August, 1942 was straightforward and, from their point of view, entirely reasonable. The Allies had attempted to seize a port, the attempt had been annihilated, and therefore the defense of ports was the correct priority for the Atlantic Wall. That conclusion was already embedded in German doctrine. Führer Directive No. 40, issued in March 1942, had ordered that any attack on a port be treated as the beginning of the invasion. Dieppe appeared to confirm the directive rather than challenge it, and the building program accelerated. According to the Canadian War Museum, in the period after the raid, by 1943, some 250,000 workers were pouring up to 800,000 tons of concrete per month into the Atlantic Wall. Other accounts record that Hitler ordered the completion of 15,000 positions before the summer of 1943, that by December 1942 about 5,000 structures had been completed, and that by June 1943 the figure had passed 8,000. Construction would intensify again under Rommel from late 1943, following Führer Directive No. 51 of 3 November, 1943. Here is the strategic irony at the center of this entire story. The Germans looked at Dieppe and concluded that the Allies would come at a port, and they fortified the ports. The Allies looked at Dieppe and concluded that they must never come at a port, and they went to Normandy. Both sides read the same 10 hours. Both sides drew a confident conclusion. Only one of those conclusions was still correct in June 1944. There is a coda to the Atlantic Wall in the words of the men who commanded in the West on the day of the raid. Gerd von Rundstedt's post-war verdict on the fortifications he had spent years building was blunt: one has only to look at it for oneself in Normandy to see what rubbish it was. A caution is worth stating here for accuracy. It is a reasonable analytical reading that German fixation on ports helped create the conditions the Allies later exploited through deception and through the choice of open Normandy beaches. But there is no documented paper trail running from Dieppe directly into specific Allied deception planning. That connection is an interpretation of how the two sides' conclusions interacted, not a recorded chain of cause and effect, and it should be presented that way. So we arrive at the question in the title. What did Dieppe actually give to D-Day? Let us start with the strongest documented evidence, because it exists and it is unglamorous. It is a line in a training précis. In the Canadian official history compiled by C.P. Stacey, the Combined Operations Précis, recording the primary lesson of Dieppe states it in terms that could not be plainer. The lesson of greatest importance is the need for overwhelming fire support, including close support, during the initial stages of the attack. That is the doctrinal core, written down, in the official record. The single largest failure at Dieppe, landing infantry against intact defenses with 4-inch guns and strafing runs as their only preparation, was identified immediately as the thing that must never be repeated. And it was not repeated. A new fire support technique was devised for Operation Overlord, including Army field artillery firing from landing craft during the run-in, so that shells were falling on the defenses continuously up to the moment the ramps dropped. The bombardment fleet off Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944 included battleships and cruisers, precisely the heavy naval gunfire that Mountbatten had asked for and been refused in 1942. Second, do not attack a defended port. This is the most cited lesson and the most defensible. Overlord landed on open Normandy beaches rather than assaulting a harbor, and ports were taken subsequently from the landward side, Cherbourg being the clearest example, approached through the Cotentin rather than stormed from the sea. Third, bring your own harbor. If you will not seize a port, you must supply an invasion across open beach, and that requirement produced the Mulberry harbors, artificial ports built in sections in Britain, towed across the Channel, and assembled off the Normandy coast, one at Gold and one at Omaha. The logic runs directly from the Dieppe problem. If the enemy holds every harbor and every harbor is a fortress, then the harbor becomes cargo. The Mulberry solution is, in modern terms, a decision to abandon fixed infrastructure in favor of a modular, deployable system, and it is the same conceptual move that reshaped global shipping in the second half of the 20th century. The shipping container did not win because it was a better box, it won because it moved the point of standardization away from the port and into the unit itself, so that the cargo no longer depended on what facilities happened to exist at the destination. Mulberry is that logic under fire: stop depending on the destination's infrastructure, and carry the infrastructure with you. Anyone who has watched a company abandon a dependency on a single physical facility in favor of a distributed, portable version of the same capability is watching a decision that the planners of Overlord made first, at scale, because a beach at Dieppe proved that the alternative was unaffordable. Alongside Mulberry came Pluto, the pipeline system to move fuel across the Channel rather than relying on captured port tankage. Fourth, build machines for the beach. The 79th Armored Division under Major General Percy Hobart was created to develop and field specialized armor for the assault, the vehicles known collectively as Hobart's Funnies. The list is a point-by-point answer to what happened on the chert at Dieppe: AVREs, engineered tanks that could demolish the obstacles and blockhouses that stopped the Calgary Regiment's Churchills on the Esplanade, flail tanks to clear mines, bobbin and carpet layers to unroll a trackway across ground that would otherwise swallow a tank, DD swimming tanks to get armor ashore with the first wave, crocodile flamethrowers. Every one of those categories addresses a specific failure documented at Dieppe. And remember Sucharov's beach track laying devices on 5 Calgary Churchills, and the 3 Oak flamethrower tanks named Boar, Bull, and Beetle. The idea of specialized assault armor was on the beach at Dieppe in embryo, and 1944 is where it arrived fully formed and in divisional strength. Fifth, know the beach before you land on it. The Chert catastrophe was, at bottom, an intelligence failure about geology. The answer was the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, formalized in early 1943 under Lieutenant Commander Nigel Clogstown Wilmot. COP teams conducted covert beach reconnaissance, swimming ashore on the occupied coast at night, taking soil and sand samples, measuring gradients, and bringing the physical ground back for analysis before a single landing craft was committed. The men of the Calgary Regiment were told to expect good grip for tracked vehicles. The men who landed on the 6th of June, 1944 came ashore on beaches whose bearing capacity had been physically sampled by men who had swum to them in the dark. Sixth, build a command system that can see. Roberts on HMS Calpe, blind behind his own smoke, reading 12 men in the buildings as a foothold, is the origin of a whole architecture, dedicated headquarters ships, improved combined operations communications, and the Naval Beach Commandos and Beachmaster Organization, whose function was to control the beach itself, direct traffic, report accurately, and give the commanders offshore a picture that corresponded to reality. 7th, integrate the air. The RAF's performance at Dieppe pushed toward the fully integrated tactical air support arrangements that supported Overlord. And 8th, create an organization whose only job is to plan the invasion. Cossack, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, was established in the spring of 1943 under Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, and Cossack's planning drew on the staff studies produced from Dieppe. That is the case for Dieppe as the raid that tested D-Day, and it is a substantial case. It is not vague. It is fire support doctrine, beach selection, artificial harbors, specialized armor, beach intelligence, beach control, air integration, and a dedicated planning staff. Now here is the argument on the other side, and it is stronger than most documentaries admit. The claim that Dieppe made D-Day possible has one enormous structural weakness, and the Canadian historian Mike Bechtold has stated it with the precision of a man who has watched the argument being made badly for years. Correlation does not imply causation. A straight-line connection between Dieppe and Overlord, Bechtold argues, does not exist. Consider what happened between August 1942 and June 1944. Operation Torch, the Allied landings in French North Africa, came in November 1942. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, came in July 1943. Operation Avalanche at Salerno followed in September 1943. Operation Shingle at Anzio came in January 1944. For major amphibious operations, each larger and more complex than the one before, each generating its own detailed after-action analysis, each teaching the Allied planning staffs about landing craft management, beach organization, naval gunfire coordination, and follow-on supply, under real conditions, at scale, against real opposition. The Allied amphibious doctrine that put 6 divisions ashore in Normandy was built incrementally, across that entire sequence. Attributing it to a 10-hour raid in August 1942 is a story that flatters a disaster by giving it a purpose. The harshest verdict comes from the Canadian historian Brereton Greenhouse, who argued that essentially no worthwhile lessons were learned at Dieppe at all, and who described the raid as pure folly. There is also a chronological problem with several of the lessons. The concept of artificial harbors was under consideration in British planning circles before the Dieppe raid. The idea that you might have to build your own port was not born on that beach. The need for overwhelming fire support in an opposed landing was not a novel discovery in 1942, it was, arguably, a rediscovery of something that ought never to have been forgotten, and Churchill's own memoir account uses precisely that framing, writing that the Allies learnt again the value of powerful support by heavy naval guns in an opposed landing. Learnt again, not learnt. And Brian Loring Villa's larger argument connects to this directly. If the raid was launched without proper authorization, then the lessons learned narrative that grew up afterwards functions as retrospective justification, a way of assigning purpose, after the fact, to an operation that could not be defended on the grounds it was actually launched for. Timothy Balzer's research into how the raid was sold to the Canadian public reinforces the concern. The meaning of Dieppe was being actively managed from the first day, before anyone could possibly have known what would be learned from it. Then there is the provenance of the most famous claim in the entire story. The Mountbatten line, that for every man who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day, has no verified source. It appears in 2 main forms. One version has Mountbatten saying he had no doubt that the Battle of Normandy was won on the beaches of Dieppe, and that for every man who died at Dieppe at least 10 more must have been spared in Normandy in 1944. The other is the compressed version: for every soldier who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day. No single verified speech, date, or publication containing those words has been located. Sources that reproduce the quotation use vague attribution, that Mountbatten would later say. And the men to whom it is attributed is the men whose organization planned the raid and whose reputation depended on its being seen as worthwhile. Patrick Bishop is among the historians who regard Mountbatten's long promotion of the rehearsal narrative as self-serving. But, and this matters, the Dieppe to Overlord connection is not purely a post-war invention by Mountbatten, and this is where the contrarian case has to be honest about its own limits. 2 pieces of contemporary evidence exist, and neither of them comes from Mountbatten. The first is Lieutenant General Harry Crerar's message to Canadian troops on the eve of D-Day itself, written in June 1944, before the outcome of Overlord was known, and therefore before there was anything to retrospectively justify. Crerar told his men that the plans, the preparations, the methods, and the technique for what they were about to do were based on knowledge and experience bought and paid for by the 2nd Canadian Division at Dieppe. Crerar wrote that the contribution of that hazardous operation could not be overestimated, and that it would prove to have been the essential prelude to the coming final success. The second is the military historian Cyril Falls, writing in the Times in early August 1944, 2 months after the landings, with Normandy still being fought over. Falls wrote that Dieppe proved to be the source from which almost every lesson affecting future operations, and especially the landing in Lower Normandy, was derived. So the connection was being drawn publicly by a serving Canadian Army commander before D-Day, and by a respected military historian within weeks of it. Whatever else it is, the rehearsal narrative is not simply a story Mountbatten invented in his retirement. And Churchill's own position on the raid was consistent from very early on. In the House of Commons on the 8th of September, 1942, 3 weeks after the raid, with the casualty figures known, Churchill said that the raid must be considered as a reconnaissance in force, and that he personally regarded the Dieppe assault, to which he gave his sanction, as an indispensable preliminary to full-scale operations. In his war memoirs, Churchill wrote that Dieppe occupied a place of its own in the story of the war and that the grim casualty figures must not class it as a failure, that tactically it was a mine of experience, and that it shed revealing light on many shortcomings in the Allied outlook. Note carefully what Churchill is and is not saying there. Churchill is not claiming the raid succeeded. Churchill is claiming that the raid was informative, and that its casualties should not be allowed to define it. That is a considerably narrower claim than the 10 lives for one arithmetic that later attached itself to Dieppe, and it is a claim Churchill made on the record, under his own name, in Parliament, 3 weeks after the event. After 80 years, 4 positions have hardened, and the honest version of this story holds all 4 of them at once. 1. The raid was a tactical and operational disaster. This is not contested by anybody. Poor and outdated intelligence, no heavy fire support, loss of surprise before the first landing, a plan that required precise simultaneity from a force that could not achieve it, and a target chosen partly because a flanking approach would not look decisive enough. The 68% Canadian casualty rate is the arithmetic of those decisions. 2. Some genuine lessons did feed into Overlord, the fire support doctrine recorded in the official history, the rejection of the defended port assault, the specialized armor, the beach reconnaissance organization, the beach control system. But the straight-line claim that Dieppe made D-Day possible is regarded by most academic historians as overstated, and partly as retrospective justification. The lessons of Dieppe were reinforced, refined, and in some cases first genuinely learned at Torch, Husky, Salerno, and Anzio. 3. David O'Keefe's intelligence dimension is a real and valuable addition to the historical record. A cryptographic pinch mission involving Ian Fleming's Naval Intelligence Division and 30 Assault Unit did go ashore at Dieppe, and it failed to reach its target. The maximalist version, that this mission explains the entire raid, is not accepted by leading Canadian historians, including Tim Cook and Mark Zulka. 4. Brian Loring Villa's authorization critique is not broadly accepted, though his analysis of the planning process is respected. The document that would settle it has never been found. Here is a way of holding all of that together that does not require anyone to lie. Dieppe was not a rehearsal. A rehearsal implies intent, that the raid was mounted in order to learn, that the casualties were an accepted tuition fee paid deliberately in advance. Nothing in the record supports that. Operation Jubilee was mounted to seize and hold a port, to destroy installations, to take prisoners and intelligence material, to satisfy an ally, and to force an air battle. It was mounted to succeed. It failed at almost every objective it set itself. What Dieppe actually was is a destructive test. That is an engineering term and it is the precise one. A destructive test is when you load a structure until it breaks, because the only way to find the true failure point is to reach it. You do not learn where the limit is by staying safely below it. And critically, this is the part that matters morally. A destructive test tells you the truth in a way that no amount of modeling or planning or wargaming can, because the failure is real and the data is not an estimate. Every organization that builds anything serious eventually confronts this. You can model a bridge, simulate a system, run a tabletop exercise on an emergency response, and you will still be surprised the first time you put the real load on it. Modern engineering formalizes this as destructive testing and failure analysis, and modern software engineering has rediscovered exactly the same principle in chaos engineering, the deliberate injection of real failure into a live system, because the failure modes that kill you are the ones your model did not contain. The Allies in 1942 believed they understood amphibious assault. Their model said that a port could be taken from the sea with surprise, light naval support, and determined infantry. Dieppe applied the real load. The structure broke, comprehensively, in 10 hours, and it broke in specific, documentable places: fire support, beach geology, obstacle clearance, command visibility, harbor dependency. The difference, and this is the difference that separates a defensible reading of Dieppe from an obscene one, is that a destructive test is normally performed on a structure, not on 916 men who were told it would be a piece of cake. Nobody chose to run that test. That is the point. The raid was not designed as an experiment, and the men who died in it did not consent to being data. What can be said is that the Allied High Command afterwards did read the results honestly, wrote them down in their training documents, and built the machinery of overlord around them, and that is not nothing, but it is not redemption either. It is what an institution owes to a failure it caused, the minimum decency of actually learning from it. The town of Dieppe still has the beach. The chert is still there, the same loose grey flint that threw the tracks off the Calgary Regiment's Churchills. The Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery at Haute-sur-Mer holds 948 Commonwealth burials and commemorations from the Second World War, of which 187 are unidentified, along with 7 non-Commonwealth burials and 2 from other periods. More than 700 of the Canadian dead of the raid lie there, in rows laid out back-to-back in the German style, preserved deliberately as the Germans arranged them in August 1942. Commemorations have continued. The 75th anniversary in 2017 and the 80th anniversary in 2022 both brought Canadian delegations to Dieppe and to Haute-sur-Mer, working with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the Vimy Foundation, and the Juno Beach Centre, including a delegation from the town of Dieppe, New Brunswick, the Canadian community that carries the name. The 80th anniversary events on the 18th and 19th of August 2022 included name readings and vigils. Among the projects marking the 75th anniversary was a Churchill tank memorial to the Calgary Regiment, recording the 13 men killed and the 167 taken prisoner. The historical argument has not stopped either. O'Keefe's work from 2012 and 2013 remains the most discussed recent reinterpretation, and academic reception remains genuinely split. In 2022, an article by M. Hamilton in the Northern Mariner examined how the official histories of Dieppe were themselves shaped, looking at the British-Canadian historical liaison relationship through 5 documents, which is a reminder that even the official record of this raid was constructed by people with institutional interests. 84 years on, the files are still being read. Let us come back to where this started. The claim is that Dieppe had to happen. That claim, in its strongest and most comforting form, the 10-for-1 arithmetic attributed to Mountbatten, cannot be verified, comes from an interested party, and should be retired. But the weaker version survives scrutiny, and it survives because of that line in the official history. The lesson of greatest importance is the need for overwhelming fire support during the initial stages of the attack. That sentence was written because of what happened on the chert at Dieppe. And on the 6th of June, 1944, off the coast of Normandy, battleships and cruisers and artillery firing from landing craft delivered exactly that, onto beaches that had been physically sampled in the dark by men who swam ashore to touch the sand, in front of tanks specifically built to cross ground that would have stopped a Churchill dead. None of that machinery existed on the 19th of August, 1942. All of it existed 22 months later. Whether that constitutes a justification is a separate question from whether it constitutes a fact. And there is one thing in this story that no interpretation touches. The men on that beach did not know they were in a test. The Royal Regiment of Canada under the seawall at Puys did not know they were teaching anyone anything. Cecil Merritt walking onto the bridge at Pourville, John Weirfoot carrying wounded men to the boats and then choosing captivity, the crews of the Calgary Regiment driving their immobilized tanks up and down an esplanade they could not leave in order to put steel between the German guns and the infantry. None of them were participating in a rehearsal. They were fighting a battle they had been told they could win, on ground that had been described to them incorrectly, with support that had been removed from the plan before they sailed. 68% of the Canadians who went to Dieppe were killed, wounded, or captured. And a nurse in Rouen who spent that day and the days after it with the ones who were brought to her said the thing that no historian has improved on: it wasn't war, it was a massacre. So here is the question worth sitting with. If the lessons of Dieppe were mostly things the planners already had reason to know, that you need overwhelming fire support, that you do not walk infantry across open ground under intact guns, that you should find out what a beach is made of before you drive tanks onto it, then what exactly was purchased on the 19th of August, 1942? Was it knowledge? Or was it just the institutional willingness to finally act on knowledge that was already there?